Welcome to the Uncharted podcast. I am your host, Inés Franklin. My hope for you today is that we discover faith beyond the boundaries. Uncharted is intended to be a safe place for you to listen, learn, and challenge yourself along your journey of faith. May grace and peace be with you today. Welcome to the show. Hello, friends. Welcome again to our podcast, to our conversation with Sharon Hodde Miller on her book, The Cost of Control. I am so glad that you're here. If you have not listened to the first podcast where we cover an overview of the book, I would highly recommend that you go and do that. It helps kind of set the tone for what we're going to talk about today. And this is going to be a 5-part series. So we're going to go through the book, and it would be helpful if you had the book as well. So you may want to pick that up at your Amazon store, wherever it is that you buy your books, The Cost of Control. Another good thing to do in these conversations is to read Genesis 3, because she refers to it a lot and is very much part of the undergirding of this whole book. So this was like a conversation with a girlfriend at a coffee shop. I have my tea. I hope you grab your coffee, your tea, your drink, and just enjoy this conversation. We would love to hear from you if you have any questions or thoughts about this. So you can always go to InesFranklin.com and send us a comment there, or email me at hello@InesFranklin.com. That would be awesome. So thank you for joining us. Share this with your friends, and let's get started. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm very excited to continue this conversation on control and on your book. And looking back at the things that we talked about already, we defined control, which I know you have this sentence in your head, like memorized. Can you just rattle it off for us just to remember?
So control is actually, there's two components to it. The first is whenever we impose our will on people or circumstances. And so when we think of control, that tends to be what we're thinking of. But I offer a second definition as well, which is simply the feeling of empowerment that we have. And really, very often, that is what we are after, is not actual control, but simply the feeling of it, which is why this concept of the illusion of control exists, is we are content with the illusion, whether or not it's real.
This is good. So I'm very, very stoked about talking about that feeling, that almost I almost heard it from you as there's a high that comes from it. There's an empowerment that we feel, a strength that we get out of it. There's a lot of words that came in my mind of like, whoa, no wonder we're hooked.
Yeah, it's stability and security. It provides, and I can't remember if I mentioned this before, but studies show that it actually lowers anxiety. It actually lowers depression when you feel like you're in control. The problem is it's not based on anything real. And so sooner or later, you will be confronted with reality. You have just delayed that. You just pushed it down a little bit. But if it works for a short period of time.
Anything that we do that passionately must work in some way, right?
Yeah.
I always think of people who are in a really bad relationship and they're coming to me for counsel. And I always go, you're getting something out of this. Like you want out. But there's something that's working for you that you need, that we need to find a different place to get that versus this relationship that's being so harmful to you, you know?
Well,
so we're clearly getting...
That's how drugs work, you know? Like that's why people become addicted to drugs, is they want that quick fix that soothes them, helps them to escape. You know, it actually works for a period of time. But then afterwards, you know, you sober up, you go through withdrawal, like whatever it is. And the illusion of control is like that. Eventually you sober up.
Yes. Very true. So last time we talked about what is control. We talked about how you came up with the topic, you know, And today I wanted to touch a little bit on one part of your answer there, like when you talked about COVID exposed for you at your church, as a leader of a church, you saw your congregation struggling through COVID, struggling with this idea of control, and you saw as exposing a gap in discipleship. And what I'm hearing is a pastor's heart for her congregation, saying, "Wow, what have I not done as a leader that has positioned people to feel this lost, frustrated, whatever the words are." So I thought maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, your heart as a pastor for your congregation, and how that was affected. And really, since then, what have you learned that helps you, care for your congregation with this in mind now?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember how much detail I went into last time, but when COVID hit, it wasn't as if our people, and this isn't just in my church, this is across the board, it wasn't as if Christians were drawing on the millennia of spiritual resources handed down to them by our brothers and sisters in the church, but also from the Word of God. We have all this wise counsel from Scripture. We have spiritual disciplines. We have Jesus himself, available to us. And instead of drawing on all of those resources to face the unknowns of what was ahead, everyone was taking their fears to the internet instead of to God. And so that was really interesting to me in terms of why is that how we are responding to this crisis, is going
like
to
there was
internet.
No difference, right? There was no difference between, well, if there was a difference, it was minor between Christians and non-Christians as to how they responded to this.
Yeah, there really was not. I mean, the differences were played out in really other ways. I mean, I don't want to get into like the politics of it, but I think some of the ways that it played out was more well, actually, you know what? I will say even Christians and non-Christians look the same this way as well. One way that control played out was an extreme emphasis on autonomy. And I have a whole chapter as autonomy as a form of control. And so there was a lot of fear. There was no difference between fear in the church and outside the church. But there was also no difference in this emphasis on autonomy, where it was, all this stuff has been taken away from me. I am no longer in control of all this. And so all that I have left to control is me. And so no one can tell me what to do. And for some people, this played out as, you can't tell me to wear a mask. You can't tell me, to get vaccinated. But for other people, it was like, you can't come near me. You can't, if you haven't been vaccinated, you can't, whatever. But it was very much like, all I have left to control is me. And unfortunately, there was no difference between the church and outside the church. And so control was this widespread coping mechanism that everyone was running to. But what made it even worse was Christians were calling it faith sometimes, as they were saying, this isn't control. This is a godly response. But everyone around you can see through it. No, you're just baptizing your control responses. So don't I'm like getting myself worked up now. So all that to say, and here's how you know it was no different. The fruit was not peace.
That's true. That's true.
The fruit was not peace.
Very true.
And that's when you know whether or not it's about control or trust, is that if it's about trust, it's about peace. And a lot of the people that were saying, like, do not be afraid, were some of the meanest bullies on the internet.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm like, this is not actual peace that you are lecturing and yelling at people about. That's not trusting in God. If it was, you would be quelling anxiety rather than stoking it.
Right. And so, it was using force. Basically, it was forced peace.
Yeah.
Which, of course, there's no such thing.
Yeah. And I want to say, I hope this is like a safe space. I'm like really getting ramped up right now. So I don't know if you
come on, Pastor. Go for it.
But I want to say, whatever perspective, whatever background you're coming from, if you're listening to this and thinking, yeah, those other people.
Yeah, come on.
The people on that political side, the people on that theological side, whatever. If you're thinking, yeah, those people, they're guilty of that. No, it was all of us.
Yeah.
It was all of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
This was across the spectrum. It was all of us, just in different ways. That fear, that hyper autonomy, it manifested in all of us, just in different ways. And so it's really important. And that's something that as a pastor is really important to me. I don't like picking on one side. I don't like saying these conservatives, these liberals, we need to know. I'm much more fascinated by what are meta patterns in our culture that transcend those differences, because a lot of times, as much as we hate to admit it, these two poles are much more similar than they are different.
It's the humanness through it, right?
Yeah,
the human undergirding all of it.
Yeah.
No matter which side we're on.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you think I'm like coming for one side over another, no, I'm not. I honestly am not. This was like widespread everywhere. It just took different forms. And so that was another way that I knew this is a big issue, because I'm seeing this issue of control on both sides, inside, outside the church, left and right. I'm seeing it play out. It's manifesting differently, but the core of it is the same. And that's always those meta trends. That's what I'm always really interested in.
Well, I'm looking forward to the next podcast. Let's make sure we talk about autonomy on that one, because last time you told us a little bit that the only thing we have, and that was just a brief introduction. I know we're going to go further into this, that the only thing we have control over is ourselves and our circumstances. And so that and autonomy, very interesting, so next podcast, I want to dive into that. Like, okay, what's the difference between...
I want to clarify, you said the only thing we have control over is ourselves and our circumstances, but I think what you meant to say is the only thing we have influence over is ourselves.
Thank you.
Yes. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Good. So obviously the response that people were having was not influence over ourselves, but control. And then therefore imposing that on everyone else. Like, this is how I'm dealing with the COVID situation. Therefore, since I'm dealing with it that way, everyone has to deal with it that way, because this is the right way.
Yeah. Well, and also God's design for the church is this vision of an interdependent body where we are all accountable to one another, and what affects one affects all. And that hyper autonomy is incompatible with that biblical vision of community. And so in God's vision, this idea of nobody gets to tell me what to do, that has no place in God's vision of church. And so that also really undermines just the fabric of Christian community when we let that cultural, secular ideology seep into the church. But we can talk about that.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. But the other side of that is when some people in the community call the shots for the community, right? So the other side of that argument is that some people have said, well, this is what community looks like. If you're part of the community, you will behave a certain way. So I feel like that's where the tension was. Do we act as a community? Do I act as individuals? And who gets to call what an individual or what a community is supposed to look like? So, man, that's a lot to talk about in the next podcast. So, but for today, that's good stuff. Okay. For today, I want us to go, we're going to do these as deep dives. So today I wanted to go back to this illusion of control and where it comes from. So we very briefly last time talked about Genesis 3, but in your book and also friends, Sharon has she presented all of this to her church as a 4-part series. Super cool. And that's available on YouTube. And so we'll put that on the show notes. So if anyone wants to watch these as well. But in the first one, you talked about the 3 sources of this illusion of control. So I thought that would be what we talk about this time. And then maybe talk about, like, how does that overlay on our journey of faith? Like, right? Like, how does that affect our relationship with God? So,
Yeah.
okay. Tell us about the 3 ways. Is it 3 ways, 3 sources? What was the language you used
Like
for
the
that?
3 reasons we struggle with
Reasons.
control.
Okay.
Yeah. The first I touched on last time is theological. We read about it in scripture, and it is universal. And we see it in Genesis 3, where prior to the fall, Adam and Eve are living in freedom and they are thriving. They have everything essential to flourish. They have, the love of God. They have unity with one another, community with God. They have purpose. They have authority. They have influence. All these things that are essential
Safety.
for yes, safety and security. So they have all that, but the one thing that they do not have is control. They are not in charge of the garden, even though they have been given tremendous influence within it. God is ultimately in charge. And that single boundary becomes a sticking point between their wills and God's. And they ultimately decide that what would make all of this goodness that they're enjoying even better is if they had more knowledge and more power. And so they eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil. And unfortunately, that rewrites all of creation, and it creates this new blueprint for human behavior that we are doomed to repeat again and again. And so every time we defy this boundary on our power by trying to control things, we are reenacting that moment in Genesis 3 again and again and again. And so there's a sense in which we have inherited this struggle. It's like a spiritual inheritance from our parents, our original parents, Adam and Eve. And so that's one reason why we struggle with control, and why it is not a question of whether you struggle with control, but how. So that's
before you go to the next one, before you go to the next one, here they were in that perfect place. And a lot of times we hear Genesis 3 spoken from the lens of disobedience, rebellion against God. So kind of a breakaway from that power that God has, or or even just simply the call of God to depend on them. But here you're kind of giving us a different picture. So when you were writing this, did you think about like, gosh, what is that? What is it about the way we were created, the way we are as humans, that leads us to want that more? To here having everything,
Yeah,
and yet wanting more.
Yeah.
Did you take that some thought? I mean, how did you reflect on that?
I mean, they believed a lie. It wasn't, the lie did not originate with them. It originated outside of them. But where they failed, and I think you could even make the argument that the sin was not spontaneous, but it was the culmination of bad decision making, where it wasn't even, I think this is what we saw was the progression from foolishness to sin, because they listened, to this liar, Satan. But what they then did was use their agency. They can influence themselves in that moment to either act on these lies or to take those lies to God and say, is this true? And so that was the moment where them saying, I can handle this myself, was it sin? Was it not? I think technically, no. We say sin entered the world when they ate the fruit. Was it foolish? Yes.
Yeah.
And so you see this, that was actually the beginning of the momentum towards self-reliance, of them saying, I can handle this myself. I can work this out myself, instead of taking it to God. And I think that is where we fail with control, is saying, before we even maybe get to sin, it's just the folly of saying, well, I can take care of this myself. I can manage this myself. So in terms of, what that means for human nature, I mean, that's venturing into like really deep theological waters
I
that
know.
I may not be.
I just wonder. I know I'm stretching you because
I need to
wasn't
pull
sure.
my husband in. He's the theologian. He has a PhD in theology. So I need to bring him in.
And I'm asking you, I'm really talking about things that we don't have answers for. So, and the text doesn't give us a lot of answers to this either. So any conversation we're having, we're just sort of thinking aloud, right? And wrestling with the text. And because the other question I asked is that did this moment of hearing a lie occurred outside of God's presence? So here they are in the garden, they're in the presence of God, they get to communicate with God anytime, they have that freedom, and suddenly they're alone, they're away from God. So I like what you're saying about this idea of foolishness, because it is a lot of steps before we end up in this situation to make some of these choices. And certainly with the problem of control, in my mind, we are our worst as far as wanting to take control when we start to separate from, well, for sure, separate from God, but also separate from each other. When we control our children, when we stop seeing them as our children, we start actually seeing them as like, these are little people that are going to do what I want them to do. There is a level of separation emotionally that has to happen for us to enforce our will upon them.
Yeah.
Right? You can't see them as fully human, right? Just like, the image of God was already spoken over Adam and Eve. They were created to be in God's likeness, and they already had God attributes, however it is you want to understand the image of God and humanity, but they already had that. So when the lie came, well, you will be like God. Wait, we're already like God. Somehow a lot of steps happen, right? A lot of distance between God to somehow forget, oh, I am like God. So why would I believe that? Where did I go on there? My thinking is really what I'm going with this is when I think of that story, I just feel like there's something beautiful with the fact that happened and something awful with the fact that it happened. In other words, that couldn't have happened if we didn't have agency. That couldn't have happened if we didn't have that freedom. So there's actually something remarkable that we have that gets used by the enemy or misused or twisted or perverted.
Yeah.
That's really the sadness of it all. It's not that what we have is a bad thing. What we have is a good thing that gets misused. Do you see that way too?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is getting into just the question of like free will and why God allowed us to have free will if it could be misused. But without free will, love does not exist. We are merely robots or puppets, but we are not reciprocating love. And so that is a really interesting like philosophical conversation. But yeah, I think it is free will is a gift by which we are able to choose to love God, but it is also a gift that can be misused. And that's what happened in that moment.
Like any other gift. Yeah. Okay. So then that was inherited. That became the destiny for all of us, not necessarily because of the genetics, but because that is the human condition. That is humanity.
Yeah. And when I say genetics, I mean like spiritual genes.
Yeah.
Spiritual genes.
Yeah.
So that's the first reason we've inherited it spiritually, you could say. And then, although actually some theologians, like some of the ancient theologians would say, we also inherited it biologically in a sense, like it's in our every fiber, every cell. Anyway,
in a way, okay, but we are a holistic being.
Yeah,
we are right, body, spirit, soul. Yeah. If there's however you want to look at that.
I don't want to go off on that tangent. Anyway,
I know.
So the second reason we struggle with it is not theological but cultural, and this has more to do with our current present cultural moment, because that theological reason, it is as ancient as humanity. There's always been an extent to which humans have struggled with control. But at the same time, we belong to a culture that is constantly promising us control. Thanks to our technological advances, thanks to modern medicine, thanks to the internet, thanks to having our smartphones with us at all times, we are constantly promised predictability. We're promised certainty, like, what the weather is going to be, probably 10 days from now. If there's a hurricane, headed your way, when within a span of hours, a package is going to arrive on your doorstep. We also have available to us, I mentioned modern medicine because of the internet. If you have a physical symptom, you have at your fingertips basically all medical research that we have to date is like available to you. And so that makes you think like, I have all this that can empower me and can, relieve my fears about, why I'm sick. And so we can know what is happening on the other side of the world, like in real time. And so all of this gives us this false sense of increased mastery over the world. And it's not that we haven't increased predictability or certainty, because in some ways we have. I do know what most likely the weather is going to be tomorrow. I am not guaranteed, but overall we have like a longer lifespan, than generations before us. And so there are some ways in which technology and science and medicine have benefited us, but we act as if, I say this in the book, we act as if our mastery of the world has increased by miles when it has only increased by inches. And when the pandemic hit, that was the market correction about our true place in the world. And that we are just as vulnerable to the unknowns, to, our capricious, unpredictable, broken world, as anyone before us. But because of our technology, we're just less prepared for it now. And oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, we created all of this. This didn't just, this cultural reality didn't just pop up from outside of us. The reality is we created all of that for our own purposes, for our own use. It almost feels like another Tower of Babel, right? Yes. In that humanity has been constructing this system that gives us that then disciples us into believing that we have control. And it fell apart. The very thing we created fell apart. In that sense, this is why the entire world, we weren't just united in that, here's a virus that's affecting our body. There are many people dying and we're faced with the reality of death, right? But we were also faced with a flawed human system that broke apart before our eyes.
Yeah. Technology and medicine have essentially become this giant, ubiquitous illusion of control. Yeah. And so what happened with the pandemic is it shattered that illusion of control. And what you saw, the response, it reminded me a little bit of when you have a giant anthill and if you poke it, or if you step on it, and it looks like, and it from before that moment, it looks like really peaceful. It's just like this beautiful anthill. But if you step on it, it's like, you just
which I have done.
Scattering. Yeah. Oh, like
and it hurts.
Oh no.
Oh yes. Red ants. Yes, I have.
Yeah, my son has done that. But they're like immediately just scattered, running everywhere, trying to, re-erect this fortress. And
good picture. That's a good picture.
That was what we looked like in those early months of the pandemic. Is our illusion of control had been shattered. And so we were running all these places trying to find, what can I retreat into instead of that, to make up for the fact that I now feel vulnerable and exposed, instead of simply retreating into God. But it is very easy to inhabit this illusion of control because of our technology. And so that is new. That is a reason we struggle with control that is new, is that we're promised. Oh, and one area of control I meant to mention that is also somewhat new is our bodies. Like, we are promised control over our bodies in a way that is pretty new, not just because of medical advances, but also because of, diet plans. We're kind of taught, like, you can have this certain body size and shape, or you can defy aging.
Right, we can change our eyes and change our faces and change parts of our bodies. Yes.
Yeah, like, here's all these, surgeries
products
or serums that you can defy aging. And so that's also another way that we are marketed this promise of control throughout the beauty industry. So that's another way as well.
It's the lie in the garden still.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Ugh.
Yep.
Wow. So a couple of thoughts came to mind as you were sharing all that. And that is I'm going back to September 11. When September 11 happened in the U.S., my daughter was in high school. And she wrote this paper reflecting on the fact that it seemed that people flocked to God. There was a lot, I might be dating myself here. I don't know how old you were in September 11, but
I was in college.
Okay. So you're close to her age, and she reflected on, like, will people stay in this posture? Whatever, the people who are around her, at least, she sensed a desire to go back to faith. Man, I did not see that with COVID. This was a global thing, and it almost didn't seem that palpable that people ran to God. So again, I go back to this idea. This is Adam and Eve in the garden. They've taken a bite of the fruit. Shame has come in, and the desire is not to run to God, but instead to hide. So the illusion has broken, and what has been our response to that illusion being broken up?
Yeah.
How did you see it from your perspective?
That's such an interesting comparison between September 11th and the pandemic.
I know they're nowhere close to the same thing, but it's the traumatic event. I'm going to look at it as a traumatic event, and as assault to our sense of security.
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is, it was terrifying and devastating, but my personal life was not affected by it at all. And so I don't know if that is a difference. I mean, yes, it changed. The world felt scarier than it had before. The world felt more unpredictable than it had before. But I still went to class that day. Everything, the only real change was airport security.
Yeah.
That was the only actual change to my life. And so I would be curious to dig into that, about why we responded to the pandemic differently. Some of it is we had the resource of community to gather together with 9/11, whereas with the pandemic, we did not.
That's true. That got closed out.
Yeah. And so,
more isolation.
And isolation is how the enemy gets to us, how the enemy lies to us. And so we were all isolated. So I would be curious. I mean, I'm just sort of spitballing right now, but that's such a fascinating comparison, because that was a terrifying event. It was a generation defining event. And yet my daily life remained the same. So yeah, I don't know.
That's good. Okay, so the third one, in the way I kind of phrased it on my notes was, the world is not as it should be, and we all know it, and we all desire to make things right. So there's a sense in all of us to try to reorder things, to put them in, reorder my bookshelf because my books right now all tilted, whatever that might be. That's in a small way, but in the big way, right? We want to make things right. And that's how the set of control seems like a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the third reason we struggle with control is simply that the world is not as it should be. The world is broken.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a really important note of compassion, like self-compassion for this conversation, because whenever we talk about control, we tend to frame it in terms of this is sin, this is about pride, this is about
Negative.
idolatry of self. And all that is true. But whenever you have an adult child, who is making really self-destructive decisions, maybe they're struggling with addiction or they're dating someone really unhealthy, whatever it is, and you wish you could reach into that situation and just pluck them out of the jaws of destruction, that is not idolatry of self. That is not believing that your power and your will is higher than God's in some way. That is a healthy response to the brokenness of the world. And that craving for security and stability is not sin at all. That is your soul crying out for the world that it was created for. We were created for security. We were created for stability. And so yearning for those things is not wrong, is not sin. Where we go off the rails is how we pursue security and stability. And we remember, for those of us that follow Jesus, that God affirms our desire for security and stability, but he sent Jesus to fix it, not us. We aren't capable of it. And we will burn ourselves out and break all of our relationships if we try. But Jesus, he has the power to heal what we cannot. He has the power to restore that security and that stability. And ultimately, that is our hope. But I think that's so important when we're talking about really painful, difficult situations where you wish that you could heal it and you wish that you could fix it. And I think for a lot of people, that is at the heart of their desire for control in some things.
So it's interesting because these three things, two are clearly, bad, right? The fact that we inherited and the fact that we have created a system that disciples us to stay in it, continues to lie to us. But the third is that it's a beautiful thing that we have that connection with God and a desire for all things to be made right. But they're intertwined. So it's so hard for us sometimes to tell which is operating. Is it the broken side of us, or is it our compassionate heart, our empathetic heart? And then how to separate those. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that the last one is important because shame is powerful, but it ultimately leads to despair. Yeah. And so for us to say, just don't control, you shouldn't control, that sin, just let go and let God, slapping people's hands so that they don't control, it ultimately feels as if we are desiring something different than God, when at the end of the day, it's no, actually the thing deep down that you're desiring in some of these situations where this is about someone that needs healing and wholeness, God desires that with you. And in fact, more so, so much that he sent his son. And so we don't have to despair in the face of our, will to control and just simply say, I shouldn't do it. But we can trust that God is actually more committed to their restoration than we are. And that is a much more empowering and hopeful message than simply telling people, stop controlling. It's bad.
Yes, good. Because that is the tactics that, right, and I'm not saying they're all bad, but the typical language, let go, right? Let go, let God, surrender, all of those things. We're talking about the other two, right? The inherited desire for control, it's only removed by the blood of Jesus. Right. So that one is right. We can't even take that off ourselves. But the disciplined side of it, that the structures and the places that we go to practice control, that is where we can let go, surrender, right? And then knowing to hold on to the third, but with a sense of like we are limited there, that there's only so much we can do. And I totally get it, Shan. My son went through a season about 7 years from being 16 to 23 where he struggled with drug addiction and he disappeared on me and he went through a really, really hard time. And I had to give him to the Lord and remember that God loves him more than I do. As much as I adore my son and I would do anything for him, God loves him that much more. And so I had a let go experience, but it wasn't I'm no longer loving my son. It's a let go of believing I had all the answers and the solution to his problem, which I didn't. I couldn't solve it.
Yeah.
I had to let that go. Let that go. Okay. I think this is a good place to stop before we go to the next one, because Kate, when we talk on our next podcast, we're going to talk about the specific tactics that we use. I'm super excited about that because I can't remember how many you put in the book. Do you remember? Well, of course you remember. You wrote it. Although I tell you, I wrote a book and I'm having a hard time remember everything I said.
Yeah. No, I think it's like 5 maybe. There's, let's see.
Yeah, knowledge and information, power. Yeah, so knowledge and information, power, money, autonomy, theology, and shame. So I'm very excited to talk about those, a couple of those at least. You know, friends, if you're listening to this podcast, you definitely need to buy the book. But we'll talk about a few of them. I'm very excited to do that.
Yeah.
Until our next conversation.
Thank you for listening to Uncharted Podcast with Inés Franklin. Learn more about Inés at unchartedpod.com. Follow Inés' journey on Instagram at Inés Franklin. Sign up for our email list to receive direct access to online experiences and more. Thanks for listening, and join us again next time.